Phil, should I introduce you and get started?
Sure, let's do that.
All right, I'm going to go then. Phil kindly provided a bio, and I'm just going to read it. And then Phil's going to give his presentation, and we'll just play it by ear. I think if it works, people can ask questions, or I'll leave it up to Phil how he wants to handle it. And then we'll have time for a discussion afterwards. So Phil, thank you very much for giving this presentation today. Phil has a BA in physics from Oxford. He did an MS in nuclear engineering at Birmingham from 71 to 72. From 73 to 78, he was senior scientist at the South African Atomic Energy Board. And from 78 to 90, he was manager of nuclear safety and reliability engineering at Rockwell International. From 1990 to 2015, he was with the Boeing Company and senior manager of radiation health and safety. And currently he has his own company, his own consulting company, Phil Rutherford Consulting. And from 21, he has been president of the Health Physics Society decommissioning section. He came to the US in 78. He's married with 2 sons. His hobbies include golfing, racquetball. I used to like squash. He's a webmaster for 2 websites, and now he volunteers at the National Park Service and judges at the annual California Science and Engineering Fair. So Phil, please introduce your topic, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, James. Maybe I should start off by explaining why I'm giving this this particular presentation. It's a little out in left field compared to most of my presentations that I've made, which have been in the technical field, obviously. A couple of months ago, James called me and said that he recalled that at one time I had said that I was that I had attended the same high school as Guy Fawkes. So he asked me if I wanted to do a presentation on Guy Fawkes, and I said, well, to be honest, I don't know any more about Guy Fawkes than probably any of you guys, and I'd have to do a significant amount of Google research to put together a presentation. But I said, the gunpowder plot was one of the early notorious examples of conflict between religion and government, because of course Guy Fawkes was a Catholic, and the government at the time was Protestant. And I said, I'm more than willing to kind of step back and kind of address the whole issue of politics and religion in general, and specifically in the US as well. So James said, oh yeah, sounds great. So here we are now, and so let me start off. Page down. Oh, okay, what's going on now? Okay, so dinner table conversation. I guess the people on the East Coast have already had dinner. People on the West Coast, maybe we're looking forward to dinner. Feel free to kind of chow down if you want. I won't be offended if anyone's eating while you're listening to me. But you probably all know the old adage that one should never discuss politics or religion at the dinner table. Well, we are going to do exactly that just now, and hopefully it'll be interesting for you guys. So let's step back a little bit and look at the world of religion. In 2014, the Pew Research Center, which is kind of an opinion poll organization here in the US, they did a study of religious diversity around the world. And so those countries, one example of a country which has a very high diversity was Singapore. And it has lots of different religions. Obviously, it allows lots of different religions in its country. At the other end of the spectrum is a country like Iran, which actually is where my wife comes from. That is 99% or more Muslim, very little religious diversity at all, less than 1% of all the other religions. The US, for instance, would be considered a moderate religious diversity country. Most people are Christians. 16% are unaffiliated. Small numbers of people in the other religions. So the US ranks 68th out of 232 countries for religious diversity. So before we get started, it may be useful to look at a few definitions. So, you know, a religious person obviously believes in God with a capital G, and is a member of an organized religion or church. There's a term called unaffiliated, and there are two different kinds of unaffiliated people. The religious unaffiliated people are those that believe in a God, but not necessarily the biblical God, so it's with a small g, or they believe in some kind of spiritual force, maybe like Star Wars, you know, forces with you. They believe there's something going on in the universe, so why are we here? But they are not really a member of any organized religion or church. Then you have the secular unaffiliated. A religion doesn't play any part in their life at all, and they aren't members of any organized religion or church. Then you have the agnostic. These are the people who sit on the fence, basically. They don't believe there's any proof of a God with a capital G, or that one exists, or that one does not exist. They basically have not decided. And then there's the atheist, who does not believe in the existence of God with a capital G, or any other God for that matter. So we'll see some of these words being referred to later on in the presentation. So again, looking at some of the data from a 2014 Pew Research study, we see that most of the folks in the US, almost 80%, are Christian, not surprisingly. 50% are Protestant. I was a little surprised actually to see that 26% consider themselves evangelical. I would have thought it was a little less than that. However, this is what the poll shows. 24%, again, almost a quarter, are Catholic. And that is interesting. And we'll see later on when we talk about some of the previous presidential elections in this country, specifically the election of Kennedy. Of course, he was a Catholic. And at the time, it was thought that, gee, maybe it would not be a good idea to elect a Catholic because maybe he'd be influenced too much by the Vatican. Of course, he was elected and he wasn't. And then other religions, a relatively small number, less than 5%, 1.7% are Jewish, a very small percentage of other ones. And then the unaffiliated group, 16%, like 12% are basically either secular or religiously unaffiliated. Only 1% consider themselves completely atheist, a very small percentage. So let's look at religion and how it's referred to in the US Constitution. So the framers of the Constitution really attempted to make it religiously neutral. And indeed, the word religion is only mentioned twice in the Constitution, and God is never mentioned once. So the first place it's mentioned is in Article 6. And again, the Constitution was written initially in 1787, and then later amendments in the later years. So Article 6 says no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust in the United States. Now that's a very interesting statement. It's based on what we see these days, and we'll kind of go over some of the issues in American politics lately. But I mean, just ask yourself the question, do you think there's any likelihood that an atheist could be elected to President of the United States today? I don't think so. So there must be some kind of religious test going on here, even though that's in violation of the Constitution here. So the next place where a religion is mentioned is in the First Amendment. And you're probably all very familiar with this one. And again, the first 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights were written 2 years after the original Constitution in 1789. It says the Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So that's a very short sentence. And in fact, it isn't even a complete sentence, because the rest of the sentence goes on to talk about free speech and freedom of the press. So this is really the key area in the Constitution that mentions religion, and it's only half a sentence. Now, I said it, religion is only mentioned twice. That's not quite right. It's actually mentioned 3 times. In the signature section, and you can read it down here, basically it says, this is signed, 1787 in the year of our Lord. So there's reference to Jesus, but not God. So people often forget that third reference. Incidentally, if anyone has any questions or any comments they'd like to make, feel free to jump in.
Bill,
So let's look at a little.
This is Chris.
Yeah.
I hear you, but something crossed my mind is that every time you pull out a dollar bill, it says "In God We Trust."
We'll get to that. We'll
All
get to that, Chris.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's a good observation. So let's look a little bit more in detail about the First Amendment. Again, there are 2 clauses here. First clause is referred to as the Establishment Clause. The second clause is referred to the Free Exercise Clause. And again, I'll say again, this is half a sentence. This is the main reference to religion in the Constitution. All the other statements that you'll see me making, and a lot of these are not me making them, but there are constitutional scholars and Supreme Court justices. So a lot of the words that are kind of talked about in terms of religion in the Constitution are people's opinions, and they amplify on that half sentence. So the Establishment Clause forbids the government from establishing an official religion for this country. It prohibits the government from actions that unduly favor one religion over another. And also importantly, it prohibits the government from preferring religion over non-religion or non-religion over religion. And again, all these words are what constitutional scholars have opined on after the fact. The Free Exercise Clause protects the rights of citizens to practice any religion that they choose, which is good. It enables them to engage in religious rituals like going to church, taking mass, saying prayers, singing hymns, etc., etc. And the third one, it also allows them to act based on those beliefs. Now, this last one is very problematic because we'll see later on that results in people of a religious belief imposing their will on other people who don't either share that belief or people who religious believers disagree with. So it allows them to act based on those beliefs. And we'll talk about that later on. So there's obviously an inherent conflict in the First Amendment here. And again, constitutional scholars and the Supreme Court have contended that and agreed that there is a conflict. Free exercise implies special accommodation of religious ideas and actions, even to the point of exemptions to generally applicable laws. Now that phrase, generally applicable laws, in quotation marks, is has a specific legal meaning. It means general federal or state laws that are apply to the whole population in general. But we'll see later on that sometimes those laws do not apply to those religious believers who claim certain exemptions. So such a special benefit violates the neutrality between religion and non-religion as mandated by the Establishment Clause. So there's a conflict. And it's led to controversial decisions by the Supreme Court, where basic human rights, including women's rights, LGBTQ rights, are violated based on protecting religious rights. Separation of church and state. This is a phrase that I'm sure everyone's heard of. And again, it is not specifically stated in the Constitution. The phrase does not occur. However, it quickly became a convenient metaphor. The framers believed, the framers of the Constitution believed, that any governmental intervention in the religious affairs of citizens would necessarily infringe on their religious freedom. And really, the first time that separation of church and state was used as a phrase was by Thomas Jefferson and others when they attempted to limit the influence of the Anglican and Baptist Church in Virginia. But of course, as Chris has pointed out, and as we'll see much more in later slides, separation of church and state is a total myth. It never existed, and it doesn't exist today. Now, the Constitution was written in 1787. That was 11 years after the Declaration of Independence, which is, of course, the other major historical document upon which the US government is made. So the opening preamble of the Declaration reads, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, I've underlined 4 words there: men, Creator, rights, and liberty. Obviously, a reference to a Creator sort of undermines the attempt of the later writers of the Constitution to be religiously neutral. Just say that, and it really solidified the American government's unbreakable link to a monotheistic God or a creator. And really, the guys in those days, say guys, we'll talk about that later on. Most all of them were Christians. They believed in God, but to their benefit, they did attempt to separate church from the running of the government, and that's why they wrote the Constitution the way that they did. However, most of them were Christian believers, so they were a little schizophrenic, or rather, the government has become schizophrenic. Now, I underline men, and men, they don't say all persons or all people or all mankind. They said all men are created equal. And of course, it was written by a rich, white, landowning man. Both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Men excluded black slaves who obviously had no liberty, all the indigenous people who were being decimated by wars and imported religion, and women, none of whom had any rights at that time. And indeed, it was well over 100 years before they got the right to vote. So in those days, the framers were men, white, rich landowning, and nobody else. A very small percentage of the population. And it's interesting that this phrase from the Declaration of Independence is one of the most revered sentences in the founding documents. Now, there are other references to a supreme being in the Declaration of Independence, and these include, in the introduction, assume among the powers of earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. Now, when I first read this, I thought the laws of nature referred to things like physics and chemistry, but no, that's not true. The laws of nature actually refer to, the biblical type laws, Abrahamic laws. And in the conclusion, there are phrases saying, appealing to the supreme judge of the world, or the rectitude of our intentions, and protection of divine providence. Now, you can translate those words into meaning, God is on our side, okay? And although the Declaration of Independence included 27 specific complaints against George III, none of them included an allegation that religious freedoms were infringed either in the old country, in the UK, in England, or during the time when Britain was still ruling a colony. So let's look at a religion in US institutions, and we'll get to what Chris mentioned earlier on. Notwithstanding the First Amendment and the alleged policy of separation of church and state, many entrenched US institutions support the belief of the Judeo-Christian God. Pledge of Allegiance. One nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, the original Pledge of Allegiance did not include that phrase, under God. It was only during the early 1950s, during the Cold War, that President Eisenhower basically forced Congress to add those words to the Pledge of Allegiance in an effort to distinguish the US, the Christian US, with the godless communists. And the national motto, again, in God we trust, that Chris mentioned. Again, a couple of years later, President Eisenhower had this added as a national motto and put on paper money, even though it had actually been on US coins since 1864, almost 100 years previously. So, one nation under God, God we trust, all this reference to a supreme Abrahamic God. A religion really became an important weapon in the Cold War. Senator Joe McCarthy, who of course was notorious for the communist witch hunts in those days, in one speech, he said, "The fate of the world rests with a clash between the atheism of Moscow and the Christian spirit throughout other parts of the world, including the US," in quotation marks. Let's look at religion in other US institutions. Now, in the US Congress, before they start work, if they actually do work, at the beginning of the morning, there's always a prayer. Now, to their benefit, they do kind of vary it. There is a specific, congressional chaplain, who I think at the moment is Christian, but they also occasionally invite other religions to participate and to give a morning prayer. Now, the first time I started getting interested in the impact of a religion on government was back in 2015, and I just randomly looked at the prayer for April 23rd, and it started off by saying, "Our graciously Heavenly Father, we come into your presence with a capital Y, today acknowledging that you, with a capital Y, alone are God and worthy of worship. We declare that you are the creator and sustainer of all things, etc., etc. We recognize your sovereign rule over heaven and earth, that your created beings are your stewards. Very, very kind of biblical, kind of monotheistic God, as Christian. So we're seeing here that separation of church and state. I mean, what is this? I mean, the whole of the US government and their institutions seems to be rest upon the existence of a creator. Now, whenever we swear an oath, when we give testimony before a court or before Congress, it goes similar to this. I do solemnly swear that the testimony I am about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God. Now, this, of course, derives from the 9th Judeo-Christian commandment, that thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. This is kind of referred to as the perjury commandment, and is the reason why one swears an oath when one is giving testimony. All well and good, that's fine. Now, one can insist on giving a secular affirmation. That's accepted, but only if you ask for it, and only if you are aware that you can. So if you happen to be a non-believer, you can say, excuse me, I'd like a secular affirmation, and I will not say, so help me God at the end. And that'll be accepted. A naturalization oath of allegiance for new citizens. I assume that all guys listening here are US citizens now, and so you have gone through this in the past, as I have done. And again, the oath of allegiance starts, I do hereby declare on oath, etc., 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 and then ends with so help me God. Now again, if you look on the State Department's website under naturalization, it'll say one can have a secular affirmation. However, of course, usually the judge or whoever is presiding will be doing this for several hundred people, and you can't really put your hand up and say, excuse me, I'd like to have a special one for me. I want a secular affirmation. So it's just left up to you to leave so help me God off at the end. It's also interesting that this whole concept of swearing an oath and saying so help me God is a way of saying, well, if you commit perjury, you are committing a sin against God. Not so much a sin against the court or against Congress. You'll be punished by the court if you are found to be giving perjury. However, you are also sinning against God. So that's a little, I think, unrealistic. The oaths that the executive branch, the president, vice president, and the legislative branch and the judicial branch all give are all very similar. I do solemnly swear, etc., etc., so help me God. Now, interestingly, the written version of the inauguration oath that the president takes does not include so help me God. And I wasn't able to find out why that is so. However, if you go back and listen to recordings of the inauguration of all recent presidents, they have told the Chief Justice to include it, and they will repeat that, even though the written version does not include that phrase. The opening proclamation before each Supreme Court session says, God save the United States and this honorable court. And then, of course, the traditional ending to all major presidential speeches says, God bless the United States of America. And I noticed that President Biden now says, and God protect our troops. So there's a controversy. There used to be "In God We Trust" as the national motto, and under God has been subject to numerous lawsuits in the past, all unsuccessful. Basically, the lawsuits have said, why are we saying this? It violates the Constitution. All the court decisions striking down these lawsuits have been, the arguments have been arguably flimsy, and I'm going to show 3 of them now as an example. So this was back in 1952 at the Supreme Court. It says the nation's institutions that presuppose a supreme being and the government recognition of God does not constitute the establishment of a church, of a state church, as the Constitution's authors intended to prohibit. Well, maybe it doesn't say you should be a Protestant or a Catholic or a Jew, but it certainly recognizes the existence of a supreme being, a God, but basically a biblical God. And so I think that argument is a little flimsy. And then the next one here, again, this is 1970, US Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. It is quite obvious that the national motto and the slogan on coinage and currency "In God We Trust" has nothing whatsoever to do with the establishment of religion. Excuse me. Its use is of a patriotic and ceremonial character and bears no true resemblance to a government sponsorship of a religious exercise. Well, I disagree. And then the last one is even more strange. 1984, again, this was the US Supreme Court. These acts of ceremonial deism are protected from Establishment Clause scrutiny, meaning they can't be struck down based on the Establishment Clause, and chiefly because they have lost, through rote repetition, any significant religious content. Well, I would argue that if they've lost any significant religious content, well, why have them in there to begin with? Just get rid of them. But of course, I don't argue before the Supreme Court, and I would doubtless lose anyway. So religion in US politics. I mentioned earlier on in the 1960 presidential election, it was seriously questioned whether a Catholic could or should be elected president, again, because of the potential influence by the Roman Catholic Church in Rome, in the Vatican. During 2008, 2012, when Mitt Romney was running, some questioned whether being a Mormon would be a detriment to being elected. And of course, when President Obama was running, it was alleged that he was a closet Muslim. It was endlessly debated. So a couple of questions here. Is the US ready to elect a Jewish president? Yeah, I suspect so. We'll see later that Jews are certainly well regarded in the US. And I guess Lieberman, who ran as a VP for someone, was also a Jew. So yeah, I think that's pretty easy. Is the US ready to elect a Muslim president? I don't think so. The mayor of London, of course, is Muslim. But I don't think that's possible in the US, certainly not today. I don't know what you guys think. Certainly chime in if you have any opinions. Is the US ready to elect a secular unaffiliated president? So if a president during his campaign as candidate says, I don't believe in God, or even if he does, I'm really, I don't go to church, religion is not important to my life at all. I don't think he would stand a chance of being elected. And of course, is the US ready to elect an atheist president? Absolutely not. No way. So until the US is truly able to separate religion from politics, which it doesn't seem to be able to do, then the US will never be religiously diverse, inclusive, or, as it really should be, disinterested.
Bill, would you not say that Trump was unaffiliated?
Oh, I'm sure he's totally non-religious. However, he claims to believe in God, I think, and I think he's been to church, occasionally. But I must admit he's a strange example.
Yeah.
We'll talk about him later. Now we concentrated on the U.S. Constitution, but all 50 states have their own constitutions, which actually I hadn't really, even if I thought about it, I really didn't think about it much. It turns out that state constitutions are definitely not religiously neutral, as the US Constitution attempts to be. So all the state constitutions, if you read them, include mention of one or several of
Call from Nicasio, CA.
I don't think that's me. Is that someone else?
I don't know. I think it would be interesting to see what the Constitution of the state of Utah says.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm just looking at all these examples of references in the constitutions to Almighty God, divine guidance, he, his, him, and capital H. I like this one, the legislator of the universe. It was obviously legislators that wrote that. Sovereign ruler of nations, sovereign ruler of the universe, etc., etc. So you see what I'm saying. Now, several states actually deny the right to hold government office or be a witness in a trial if they do not believe in a monotheistic God. Now, this is pretty amazing. Straight away, it is in violation of Article 6 of the US Constitution, which says there'll be no religious test to hold public office. Straight away, that kind of violates that. So these states down at the bottom here, many of which are southern states, Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, Texas, South Carolina. Maybe it's not surprising that they have that in, but Maryland and Pennsylvania, surprising that they have it in. Now, I haven't seen any evidence that these have actually been, attempted to be, enforced. And I think if they were, then there'd be a pretty fast lawsuit, and it would be tried in the Supreme Court eventually, and they'd probably be shot down. However, the fact that there is wording in constitutions that say this is pretty amazing. Okay, now we've focused on the US since we all live here. Let's look at the UK. Of course, in Europe, 16th century Reformation switched from Catholicism to Protestantism. Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife, and the Pope wouldn't let him, so he breaks from the Roman Catholic Church. The Church of England basically becomes Protestant from there on. Now, the UK is a little schizophrenic as well here. Church and state have never claimed to be separate in the UK, as they have done in the US. But indeed, the King and Queen is a ceremonial head of the Church of England. So that would be a little difficult to separate church and state. Many Catholic traditions have actually been maintained in the Protestants, Anglican Church of England. Christening and baptism and communion and mass, they've been retained. The UK society in general, I believe, is more secular than the US society. And these data were taken from a recent report by the British Council. So the percent of the population who are unaffiliated remember that means that religion really doesn't play any role in their life. 49% in the UK, that's pretty high. That compares with 21% in the US. Now, 21% is a little higher than the previous data I was given from the Pew report, which said 16%, but I guess 16 and 21% are pretty close, given that it was a different study. And of course, there's no "God bless the UK" said in any political speeches by any prime ministers, from what I'm aware of. But of course, the national anthem, the title is "God Save the Queen." So in the UK, they don't bother about separation of church and state, and things are a little schizophrenic. UK politicians do not need to affirm a belief in God, as do US politicians. And we'll see later on examples of US politicians who are actually atheists. Past UK politicians have been atheists, I've just said that. So in the UK, James Callaghan, the Prime Minister, he was an atheist. Nick Clegg, the Deputy Prime Minister under David Cameron, also leader of the Liberal Democratic Party, he's an atheist. And the two Miliband brothers, they're atheists too. They're pretty high up in the UK government and freely admitted they were atheists. Interestingly, Nick Clegg, I don't know whether any of you realize this, but he is now Vice President of Global Communications for Facebook. Kind of a different sort of a career move from being a politician. And also in France, Francois Hollande was an atheist. Now, it's pretty hard in the United States to find any well-known politicians who freely acknowledge their atheism. Pete Stark, a Democrat from California, Jared Huffman, again from California. So Barney Frank is an interesting guy. I'm sure a lot of you remember him. He was a long-time senator, a 30-year senator from Massachusetts. And he was also gay. And very early on in his political career in the Senate, he acknowledged that being gay. And but he only acknowledged being an agnostic, kind of wavering towards an atheist, but mainly an agnostic. But he only acknowledged that after he left the Senate and after he retired. So he obviously figured that it was more kind of sort of politically disastrous to acknowledge being a non-believer than being gay. Which again, back in the 80s, that was not too agreed on.
Well, he was more than just gay, though. He was a pedophile.
Okay, I guess I didn't know that. Okay.
I don't know whether that makes him closer to God or further away.
Well, yeah, we can refer to Catholicism a little bit later on. So the US Supreme Court, this is a little side issue here, but again, it's one of my passions.
I think this is very, very interesting, the present makeup of the Supreme Court.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And of course, it's in the news.
Given what's going on as well.
So yeah, perhaps the most important branch of the US government is the Supreme Court. I'm sure they would agree with that. And of course, the court interprets the Constitution and the constitutionality of legal and controversial issues and opines on existing laws and statutes, and basically opines on anything that's controversial. And it deals with issues where so-called religious rights threaten human rights. And I mentioned this before. Human rights, for instance, women's rights, LGBTQ, etc. Examples of conflicts and issues in the past: the Hobby Lobby, which is a company that deals with hobby stuff. They have brick and mortar stores and online. Their insurance plan several years ago removed all insurance for family planning and contraceptive services because the family that owned, Hobby Lobby were religious, and they disagreed with all that stuff. And it went to the Supreme Court, and Hobby Lobby won. There was a bakery that refused to cater to same-sex weddings. Went to the Supreme Court, and they won. And then, of course, abortion, which is in the news all the time these days, challenges to Roe versus Wade, the court's refusal to block the Texas anti-abortion law. And just this last few days, they've been hearing the law from Mississippi that attempts to reduce the time period for abortion from 24 weeks to 15 weeks. Sounds as though they are maybe thinking of doing that. Apparently, it'll be next year before we hear any decision. So, suggested changes to the US Supreme Court. I guess, again, this is a favorite subject of mine. I think we should increase the size. It would increase the diversity. It would be harder for one new judge of one political persuasion to upset the balance. They require a 2/3 majority for any decisions. In criminal courts, the jury has to have a unanimous majority. Okay, 12 out of 12. In civil court, you need a 2/3 majority to make a decision. So, in my mind, a 5-4 decision by the Supreme Court, of which usually in controversial issues it is, or it used to be 5-4. These days it'll probably be 6-3. To my mind, it's not a decision at all. It's just a split. So having a larger number of people and having a majority decision, we should eliminate split decisions with simple majorities of 1. Impose some kind of term limit, for instance, 12 years. That would eliminate the influence of lifetime appointments. Some of them are elected, or appointed when they're 50. They could be on the court for 30 years or more. But do not allow the court to select its own cases. The Supreme Court chooses which cases it wants to hear, and therefore, depending on its selection bias, it can sway the whole path of Supreme Court decisions. So really, and certainly discontinue presidential appointments.
Who would you have select the cases?
Well, I've got it down here. I've said that they should be nominated by the lower courts who know more about which people would make appropriate as judges, nominated, and then they should be elected by the people, same as all the other politicians, and hopefully it would reduce the influence of politics. Now, I'm not saying it's an easy thing. I know in general in local elections, when you see a whole list of judges going for a local court, no one's heard of any of them. So you think, well, who on earth do I vote for? And it's not easy. I don't have all the answers, but something's got to be done with the Supreme Court. And also require all the justices to swear on the Bible maybe, that they will not allow their political affiliations or religious dogma to influence their decisions. Yeah, I'm not sure how that could be done.
I think they already do that, don't they?
Religious rights.
Mm-hmm.
In my mind, and again, I acknowledge this is my opinion, the only religious right is your right to worship your God. You do not have the right to negatively influence the rights of others based on your religious beliefs and actions. Now, that statement, I recognize, violates some people's interpretation of the free exercise clause, which says the religious people can act on their religion. So yeah, it isn't in violation of that. And so be it. It's golden rule. I'm sure everyone knows the golden rule. Jesus said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's in various locations in the Bible, in various different wording, but essentially says the same thing. Most all religions, not just the Judeo-Christian, most all religions have a similar moral directive because it makes sense. Note that this actually does not appear in the Ten Commandments. I can talk about the Ten Commandments, but I won't. So a modern affirmation of the golden rule could be, we'll treat all others with the dignity, equality, and respect that they deserve, regardless of color, ethnic origin, gender identity. That's a new one, of course, these days. Sexual preference, political persuasion, or religious belief. So let's jump back to, how are we doing? We're almost finished. Let's jump back to some of the Pew Research data from 2014. This is the American public's attitude towards different religions. And so the public views evangelicals, Jews, and Catholics most favorable. They're up here in the 60s. The public views Muslims and atheists most unfavorably. They're down here in the 40s. Now, actually, the opinions that are still pretty tightly bunched in the middle there. They're all about 50% plus or minus 10, which I think is pretty good. Now, if you look at the religious attitudes between believers and non-believers, obviously, white evangelicals view atheists most unfavorably down here, and then atheists view evangelical Christians most unfavorably as well. That's not surprising. And again, there's much wider spread in the thermometer. Of course, remember, the high end is the warm attitude, and the low end is the cold attitude. Just said that. Okay, let's look at attitudes of Democrats and Republicans. So Republicans view evangelicals, Jews, and Catholics favorably, similar to the general public, but the Democrats view Jews and Catholics favorably, but not evangelicals. Both Republican and Democrats view atheists and Muslims most unfavorably, very similar to the general US population. Interestingly, look at the spread. With Democrats, there's a very tight spread in the middle here, i.e. they're pretty tolerant of everybody. The Republicans have much more of a widely divergent spread. They love evangelicals and hate Muslims and atheists. Recent headlines regarding religion. Recently, a Texas death row inmate alleged violation of religious freedom because the prison authorities disallowed a pastor to touch the inmate and say prayers at the time of his lethal injection. So much so that the Supreme Court stayed the execution and will hear the case. And that's still ongoing. I'm sure you've heard about this. US Catholic bishops are proposing denying President Biden the sacrament because of Biden's position on abortion. Although he's a Catholic, he supports Roe versus Wade. And of course, these days, vaccine mandates is in the newspapers all the time. No matter what mandate any local authorities or companies institute, they always have a waiver for medical reasons, which is okay, but also religious objections. I can't see any real religious objections, and indeed, most people who object to vaccines against COVID or religious objections, they probably don't even go to church. They're just using that a convenient route. So we can ask ourselves a couple of personal questions, and maybe we can talk about this at the end in our discussion. But does your own religious faith allow you to accept others with different monotheistic beliefs? I think in general, and probably people do. But does your own religious faith allow you to accept others who do not share your belief in a monotheistic God? I don't know. I'd like to hear what everyone says. But do you believe that belief in God is necessary to be a moral person? A lot of my friends who are religious and Catholic, I have a lot of Catholic friends. They have something that, well, if you don't believe in God, then how can you be good? How can you have a set of morals? They think that, like the biblical Ten Commandments is the sole source of morality. I don't see that. Do you believe that the national identity should be guided by religion? That's what we've been talking about here. And if not, how can we fix it? I don't know the answer to that. So, and again, we're right at the end here. And we're back to the first slide, the dinner's table conversation, politics and religion. I believe one definition of politics, or one aspect of politics, is the control of the many by the few. We elect our politicians, they go to Washington or Sacramento, and then they do what they like, basically ignore us until the next election cycle. And to my mind, religion is also exactly the same. The control of the many by the few. The few, of course, being the priesthood, the rabbis, the imams, and the few, of course, are controlled by the one, the supreme being, God with a capital G. In my mind, religion was the first political tool, and we can talk about that afterwards. I'll explain what I mean by that. And I believe that religion is still a political tool today. That's all my slides. If this talk about the impact of religion on government is just one chapter in a like an essay that I recently wrote during the initial COVID shutdown when I had nothing else to do. And if any of you would like to read this, it's about a 100-page essay on religion and atheism in general. Then you can go to that website. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Phil. Any question, Chris? You want to ask some more questions?
Well, I think he's put a lot of work and thought into this, and it raises a lot of interesting questions. Couple of comments I have. One is, I think the Supreme Court makeup at the moment is very interesting, because a lot of, I don't know how many, but a lot of those Supreme Court justices are Catholics.
Yep, that's correct.
Is it 4 or 5? I'm not sure.
I think it's more. I mean, all the recent 3 are all Catholic, and several of the
Roberts is
ones
Catholic.
as well.
I don't know about Clarence Thomas, but to me, that's, and Kavanaugh kind of said it yesterday, that should the Supreme Court even be making these decisions about abortion, because it's not in the Constitution per se.
Yeah. Well, see, I have. I mean, in a way, I agree with him. I feel that the U.S. spends way too much time and effort and argument talking about the Constitution and the constitutionality of this and that, because, I mean, the example we looked at, the religion is talked about in half a sentence.
Yeah.
And everybody, you know, kind of opines and interprets what that half a sentence means. And you know, the Second Amendment, you know, the right to bear arms. I mean, that was in the time when they were fighting the British and worrying that the British would invade again, and it was important that everyone had a gun and could shoot all the British. Well, that doesn't
with muskets, though.
Yeah, but I mean that doesn't you know apply today, and so there's a lot. So I heard some of the comments as well that I mean, when you look at a particular issue, the Constitution says very little about it, and it's all these, you know, lawyers and Supreme Court justices and, you know, social media and cable news, they're expressing their opinions and trying to use the Constitution as like a crutch, and the UK doesn't have a constitution.
It's the way of making a living.
And the UK is doing pretty well without a constitution. So I think that the whole idea of the Constitution and a Supreme Court that has to interpret the Constitution is just ridiculous.
Well, the other comment I had, Phil, goes back to the founding of the country as we know it today. In other words, the Pilgrim Fathers, who were in fact a religious group that was persecuted in their home country, and they fled to the United States to escape the persecution.
Yeah, I think was that mostly from Europe rather than from England?
Well, no, it was from England, but they went to Holland first.
Yeah,
they spent several years in Holland, and then I think trying to figure out what to do. They were basically Quakers.
Yeah. No, I mean that's what I said. I said so. Most everyone in those days, you know, even up to the the founding fathers, I mean, were predominantly some denomination of Christianity.
Yeah.
But it was interesting that in the Declaration of Independence, when they listed down 27 individual complaints against George III, not one of those mentioned religion, which I thought was very odd when I took the time to read them all. So yeah, there's a very kind of there's a lot of weird stuff.
Oh, you kind of wonder. You kind of wonder how many of the founding fathers were closet atheists or closet, agnostic. We just look at today's Congress and today's Senate. You wonder how many of people there are closet atheists or agnostics. That there are a lot of them. Some of them are smart people, and they can figure things out.
Yeah.
But it's necessary to portray a certain thing in order to advance. And the same was probably true 250 years ago.
Yeah, you too. I mean, I think your term, use of the term, closet atheist is very true. The politicians realize what I've just been saying here, that you can't get elected in the US unless you profess to believe in a monotheistic God in one of the three religions, and so they realize that, so they'll just keep their head down under the radar and just claim they do and just hope it goes away. I think there was a survey of all the so House of Congress and senators, and I think maybe one or two profess to be out and out atheists. and everyone else just say, heck no, I believe in God. So it's just convenient for them to say that.
As you said, if you're an atheist, you're a communist
Yeah.
in the American lexicon. You know, have any of you ever seen Michael Palin's series? You know, he meets up. You know who Michael Palin is? You know, the Monty Python crowd. You know, and he meets up with the Dalai Lama in somewhere in India or something like that. You know, and they have a big discussion. And finally, the Dalai Lama says to Michael Palin, "Well, I haven't asked you about your religious beliefs, Michael. What are your religious beliefs?" And Michael says, "Well, I guess I'm sort of, what's the word in the middle? Agnostic, but an agnostic with doubts." I thought that was just great. Because you know what he meant.
Yeah. Yeah.
Phil, I have a question. Thank you very much for your overview. Fascinating. I wondered if you looked at the influence of the lack of church and state in US politics and US government, and its impact and influence on US foreign policy.
No, I didn't, and you'll probably notice that there was maybe a gap in my logic. I kind of pointed out all the references to God, etc., in established U.S. institutions, but then I didn't really go very far in kind of saying, well, in any policy, whether it be foreign policy or domestic policy, has religion impacted any of that policy? I didn't go that far. I thought that was too much like going down the rabbit hole. So I don't know. I mean, obviously, it affected Trump's policy in his Muslim ban when he was first elected. But using him as a general example of U.S. politics is probably a bad idea.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Does anybody really want to go there? I certainly have gone there. In that I was doing quite a bit of research on the impact of Christian evangelical thinking and belief, and its impact on the Oval Office and policies internationally, but in particular in the Middle East. And initially I was looking at the 1980s campaign held by kind of Christian conservatives in their Jerusalem campaign, JERUSALEM, Jerusalem campaign, which at its heart were individuals like Jimmy Swaggart, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robinson, a number of others that were effectively influencing Reagan's White House in relation to its policies in the Middle East, and in particular towards the state of Israel, based on this kind of theology around fulfilling prophecy in the Middle East, and actually conflating the state of Israel with the biblical Israel, but following a tradition of literal truths and literal interpretation, and adding 1 and 1 and coming up with 5. But what's interesting is, it actually, in its wake, influenced votes and funding and all these things that are wonderful in this country, the lobbying system. And it's just absolutely fascinating. I initially linked in with one or two academics at Northwest and elsewhere. And it's very controversial. It's very controversial because, you know, any critiquing and observation and just laying out the facts and looking at trends, when it becomes uncomfortable, it's put out with the red card of anti-Semitism.
Exactly.
And you know, everybody will stay away from that. But the brave academics will look at it, and it's actually something that somewhere like the UK just doesn't really. It's never got the traction that it has here. That way of thinking and how it manifests into policies. But the impact of everything that you've raised on, which is fantastic, on international policy and action and justifications is fascinating. And then if you break that down by particular theater of operations, and as far as the US is concerned, the Middle East has been a major part. Only now have we exited, we here in the US have exited the Middle East in terms of troops. But for some time, it's dominated international policy here, and at its heart has been a lot of the items that you've discussed in some form or another.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you've said. I think the American policy towards Israel and the state of Israel, certainly in the last 4 years, I mean, the Trump administration has gone from, bad to worse. And in a way, I mean, I'm not anti-Jewish, I'm anti-religion, period. As you probably gathered. I mean, I'm anti-Catholic, I'm anti, kind of religion in general. I'm certainly not anti-Semitic, but I think it was a really bad decision by I guess it was the League of Nations after the Second World War, to basically make the state of Israel. I mean, they basically did a replay of the biblical story. In the days of Abraham and Moses and Joshua, the Lord God kind of allowed them to defeat the people of Canaan, and so kick them out and beat them in a war, and then it gave the promised land to the Hebrews or the Jews, and that's exactly what happened after the Second World War, when they made the state of Israel and basically, kicked the Palestinians out, and now they're second-class citizens. I mean, I thought that was a terrible political decision. And I guess, even though I've not really read that much about it, I mean, I'm sure, obviously, the reason for that was to make amends for the Holocaust.
What I would say is if we stuck on the stream of Christianity and how Christianity has had this influence. I mentioned I was looking at the Jerusalem campaign of the 1980s, JERUSALEM. But actually, when you go through the stream of particular evangelical thinking of the Plymouth Brethren and Nelson Darby and the group that originally came to New England, there is this way back to the very first European English settlers here, when they came over with their strand of Christianity. At the heart of that is this premillennial dispensationalist thinking, which is a sense of, looking for the rapture of the parousia, the second coming of Jesus, and all those things that we hold true in our understanding and belief of the Bible will be fulfilled and prophecy will come about. Now that is all the way back to Nelson Darby and the Plymouth Brethren. But what's interesting is, so I was looking at that 1980s Christian group influencing the Oval Office, but then you see it in the last administration emerging, and you see, Mike Pompeo making references to the rapture, and I just couldn't believe it. There is that strand that permeates a particular way of thinking and electability, I guess, to a particular group. It's real alive and kicking. And I was looking at this as an MPhil actually at Birmingham after my BA at Birmingham. I ran out of money, and I always thought, well, I won't be able to continue this. But here, years later, I end up living in San Francisco, and I see it's as, not in San Francisco, but in the popular way of thinking in the politics here in the US, it's as alive as it ever was. And it's not a recent creation in any way. It does go all the way back to this premillennial dispensational thinking of the rapture and conflating this state versus biblical understanding. But it's just enormous. And so I watch the press and I make the observations, I watch the debates and the hustings, and I am just fascinated by it all from what I recall from studying, but also grateful that I don't see that from my time in the UK.
Mhm.
Well said.
Well, Lee is right, that this sort of thinking, and I'm going to portray a bit about myself, I guess, when I do this, but the whole idea of rapture and the right wing in America, and it's part of their whole belief that the environment doesn't matter because the rapture is coming, and doesn't matter how much we screw up the earth right now, it'll all be made right in the rapture. And that's part of the belief, I'm afraid. And it's tough to recognize that. I'm not particularly liberal, but that's a definite concern, that people don't have a concern about the future because they believe the future will be taken care of for them. And I think I'm saying the same thing as Lee is, basically. Am I right, Lee? You're nodding.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That is an established way of thinking, and it's a way of thinking that that isn't a stream as popular a stream in other major Western democracies.
Yeah, I must admit, I really haven't done much reading about the rapture. I mean, is this like the second coming? Is that what that means?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
I mean, it's just, I mean, it amazes me how so many supposedly, intelligent, smart people
In America,
all over the world, to believe all this.
yeah.
I mean, I mentioned in the last couple of the charts that religion is a political tool. It was and it still is. And the reason I say this is that, I mean, if you read all the stories in the Bible about all the prophets, so Abraham and Moses and Joshua and Isaac and everyone, and even going back as far as Adam and Noah, I mean, they had problems with controlling their people. Okay, they were, I guess, the leaders at the time, and they had problems controlling their people because, of course, they didn't have TV, internet, they didn't have microphones, etc. They didn't have newspapers. They just had a spoken word. And as all the tribes increased, it was hard to control them all. of course, in the pre-mono, monotheistic days. I mean, the pagan days, and I mean, the people worship lots of gods. Okay, and so people were used to worshiping lots of gods. So then, these guys were really smart. I mean, they invented this one God, the Lord God, the only one who demanded to be worshipped. And rather than telling all their people what to do, giving them laws, how to conduct their lives, they said, well, the Lord God is speaking to me, and he is telling you guys to do all this stuff, the 10 Commandments and all the other laws in the Bible. And they were really smart. And so people bought into it. So a man invented God rather than, God created man. And it worked. And so then, and so it was actually a good political ploy. It was the first politics. Religion was the first politics. And but the problem is, of course, people continue to believe this myth in a supreme being in the sky, and they continue to believe it today. And that's what I find incomprehensible.
And the upshot
so that's
is
why I said that religion is still a political tool today.
Yeah.
But what Lee has been saying, I guess I haven't read anything about that, but it is interesting that there are agendas and reasons for them, and if people really believe in the second coming, then wow, I hadn't known that.
I mean, I don't. Sometimes I don't actually think that people believe it per se. Obviously, if there is a platform and a way of thinking that influences, depending on what an agenda you have, you would manipulate it accordingly. Trump taking that body of votes from the evangelical stream and having Pence as a running mate is one great example. There was a hilarious interview where a Christian channel asked candidate Donald Trump, sir, you say that you're an evangelical Christian, and can I just ask which do you prefer? What are some of your favorite books, either in the Old or the New Testament, sir? And he just squirmed and he says, I like both. I like both. I like a bit of both. Tremendous. I like a bit of both.
Sounds like Sarah Palin answering the question, about which newspapers did you read? All of them.
And so I don't think you necessarily have to believe it. I would agree, Phil, that it seems quite jarring to think that people may believe that. I don't think people necessarily do, but I do think that they will nail their flag to that particular pole or mast if it suits their agenda. And the area of the Middle East, is where there are a lot of funds and there's a lot of influence. And of course, in the 1980s Jerusalem campaign, there was communism as another layer which influenced people's thinking, and they're jockeying for position. So it was partly anti-Soviet in their thinking. I think there are lots of factors that play here.
Very many.
Yeah, absolutely.
Politics of oil.
Yes. But the interesting thing is you do not get that conflagration in Canada, in the US, in the UK, in Australia, in other Five Eyes nations or other Western democracies to the extent that you do here. And, when you see policies unravel and you look at something like what we've discussed, you could easily look at causations and correlations and make a case quite easily, I think.
Yeah, well said. Enjoyed your talk, Phil. Excellent.
Yeah, very good. Yeah.
I suppose at the end of the day, you could argue that countries get what they deserve politically. They end up with it.
I guess so.
I mean, you know, there's I don't know. There's some truth in that. I don't know.
Okay, well, that was a great talk, Phil. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Hopefully you got people thinking a little bit.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you, Phil.
Anyway, take a look at my little essay that I put together, and you know, kind of let me know what you think. Any ideas, any suggestions? If you think it's totally out of whack.
Okay.
Well, thanks again very much for your presentation, Phil, and thanks everybody for tuning in and your comments. And I guess we won't see you again till next year, but great to have you all, and hope you all have a great Christmas and New Year.
Okay.
Okay, happy holidays.
Yeah.
Thank
Talk to you all.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.